Good afternoon and welcome to this new webinar organized by ERA, the European Union Agency for Railways. My name is Thorsten Hahn and I am the moderator of this event for you today. I really like to encourage you today to participate actively. Your opinion, your questions, your feedback are important to us. Allow me to introduce our speakers and detail this afternoon's agenda. We are honored to welcome the guest speaker, Kier Fitch, Head of Unit Rail Safety and Interoperability at the European Commission's Directorate General for Mobility and Transport. Mr. Fitch is a friend of ERA, a friend of rail transportation, a visionary and a policymaker for the future of rail and broader transport. Also with us are our Executive Director, Josef Doppelbauer, and Torben Holvert, the team leader within the Analysis and Monitoring Unit at ERA. What have we prepared for today? What is going to happen in the next 60 minutes? Post-pandemic recovery of rail transportation. The big title. The title speaks for itself. I think we will have interesting presentations, interesting facts, and a lively dialogue. We start an introduction by ERA's Executive Director. Then our colleague Torben Holvert will present the first mathematical model developed to estimate and compare the travel safety under pandemic conditions on a long-distance train trip. Mr. Kier Fitch will share his insights regarding ERA's mathematical model, and Mr. Fitch will highlight the way that the European Commission has put forward its proposal for a major recovery plan. So I believe we do have important topics to present and to discuss that touch transport and traveling needs and habits of all European citizens. I'm excited, and for sure we have a very interesting hour ahead of us. I consider important also to mention that after each presentation we open up the floor to questions from our audience. You can ask questions to panelists using the chat function that you will find on the top right corner of your screen, or you vote for questions that you like that were posed by other attendees. You can click the thumbs up icon. This webinar is recorded and it will be available on our YouTube channel and on our website right after. Before giving the floor to our Executive Director, I would like to invite you all to really take part in a simple poll question that we prepared for you. And the question is, which shall be the main elements to be considered for a post-pandemic recovery of rail transportation? So just please click on the link we provided in the chat to make a choice. You can make a choice 3 out of 6 possible answers. We will come back to you with the results of the poll after the end of this webinar. We will publish the results on the dedicated website for this event. And now, enough introduction. Please welcome Josef Doppelbauer, Executive Director of ERA. Josef, your floor.
Many thanks, Thorsten, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first also welcome our guest speaker, Kier Fitch of the European Commission. Actually, you see me on the picture sitting in front of ERA in Valenciennes, but today, for the first time after many months, I'm actually in Brussels in an office very close to the office of Kier Fitch. And I took the train this morning to go to Brussels, and I have to say it actually felt quite normal. So the topic of today is post-pandemic recovery. We all have felt that the pandemic has changed our perspective. It has changed our way of life. In my case, I have been in Valenciennes for a very long time and not moved anywhere. The COVID pandemic has changed Europe, and even I would be tempted to say the fundamentals of our world. For the foreseeable future, the pandemic will continue to be a test for our societies and the economies, for our way of working and living together. If we look at the specific situation of the European railway industry, we have clear indications that the COVID pandemic has produced important financial damages. Services had to be reduced, the number of tickets sold went down, and this has, of course, caused a major economic impact. Today, we will speak about the post-pandemic recovery of rail transportation, and we will do this from the perspective of ERA, an agency that has as its mission to help creating the single European railway area. And above all, it is our motto to make the railway system work better for society. The choice of the mode of transport is, of course, the choice of the individual passenger. But many of these choices are taken not on a complete understanding of the situation, and therefore we plan to launch a joint campaign with the European Commission, but also with the European stakeholders from the sector organizations to actually promote rail. And what would be better timing than connecting this to the European Year of Rail? We need to restore the trust in rail. I believe rail has demonstrated during the pandemic that it is resilient. The transport and supply chains were kept alive, and rail freight really played an important role. But we also need to join forces now to secure long-term travel safety. So we can, in fact, learn from the experience of COVID and be better prepared for future situations, be it another pandemic or be it another possibly environmental issue. During the pandemic, the agencies have provided, and we will continue to provide, support to the railway sector by giving technical advice, by sharing information, by producing guidance such as the COVID-19 rail protocol and the COVID-19 ventilation bulletin, both of which were published in 2020. We continue to closely monitor the situation, and we are in permanent contact with the national authorities, the European Commission, our sister agencies in the European Union, and we are ready and will continue to share relevant information. I already mentioned the perception of rail and other means of collective transport, which is currently influenced by a vision that it is more safe using the private car than using collective means of transport. We will show today that if you do a holistic consideration of transport safety, then indeed rail still compares very favorably. And of course, we should not forget, by all the discussion about pandemic, that there is a bigger risk, a bigger issue, which is behind everything, which is the climate challenge. And also, I experienced it just today in Brussels, the congestion that you have in many cities. So it is essential to rebuild this trust and to make railways the first choice for our passengers again. We will have to convince people with valid arguments, and of course, positive feedback will encourage further people to come back onto rail. Today's webinar will be a first step which should launch our publicity campaign. We will share the visuals of our campaign, and if we could have the slide to show what we would like to do. In 2021, we would like to show events and initiatives together with the Commission, the member states, and the sector. We will continue to play our major role, and this role is bringing the sector together. I strongly believe that the best way forward is to support the jointly identified solutions and to apply the practical tools capable to respond in real time to the railway sector needs. One of the first steps, and Torben will shortly be presenting the main results today. The study is a clear deliverable that estimates the COVID-19 risk when traveling long distance by train, and it will also provide the necessary arguments for building up the knowledge that can in turn used by the public, but also by the decision makers. On the slide, you see a kind of schedule of the activities, also further webinars that will be run by the agency. There will be one by the end of June, expressing the progress in railway safety. In October, we will continue with measures on rail recovery, and finally, we will have the Railway Safety Days in November, which also will conclude the effort that we are currently doing with the European Railway Safety Culture Climate Survey. So this is a campaign that should support the rail recovery, but now I would like to hand over to Torben. And Torben, please present the highlights of your study entitled Travel Safety During COVID-19 for Passengers Traveling Long Distance by Train and Other Modes. Torben, please.
Shall we maybe continue, Joseph? And can you maybe say a few words about the study yourself before we have Torben back as an expert? So then we can move on later with Kier eventually, if in case we don't get Torben back.
Well, I can try to give you some of the highlights while we are waiting for Torben. As I said in my introduction, we hear from the press that there are concerns by the European citizens, and we see also clear indications in terms of the number of people using rail, but also the number of people who are buying cars because they believe that they are better able to manage the COVID risk if they use the private car. And we are convinced that in every time of uncertainty, it is better to go back to some facts and to some mathematical modeling and to try to estimate what are the actual risks. So to give some orders of magnitude, to give a better comparison of this risk. I understand that Torben is back now, at least by phone. So Torben, if you are online, I would like at this time to hand over to you. Torben, please.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're well, and it's a pleasure to be here. Sorry for the problem with the sound and the connection, but I will take you through the presentation. So, getting started, COVID-19 affected and still affect all of us in our professional and personal lives. Available information suggests clearly that European citizens are concerned about traveling by train and other forms of collective transport during the COVID pandemic. Many people seem to have switched from using trains to traveling by car. As always, in times of uncertainty, mathematical models based on available evidence can help to estimate the actual risk and add to more objectivity, while of course also recognizing the inherent uncertainty in such an exercise. I will take you through the main part of the presentation of the study, and it will cover the following main elements. Firstly, I will explain what the study question is. Then I will explain what the scope of the study is. I will then give a bit of detail about the underpinning modeling behind the study in terms of the incremental risk for COVID infection for passengers. I will take you through also, and this is quite important, the assumptions that has been used. This is a mathematical exercise, and in order to calculate risk and calculate relative risk, we would also need to put assumptions in. I'll go through those briefly. Then I will explain perhaps the most interesting part of the presentation, the study findings. I will cover also study limitations, and finally I will close with some concluding remarks. So, taking now brief on the study questions. We started from addressing the essential questions, and the key element here is the general primary question would be, what is the incremental risk of COVID-19 infection during travel for travelers using collective means of transport? And ultimately, there are some secondary questions also of importance. First of all, what is the risk of death or hospitalization of an uninfected passenger when traveling in the same means of transport with a passenger infected with COVID? And also, that's only the incremental risk, but then we also need to look at what is the overall fatality risk, for a passenger on board an aircraft, train, coach, and car. I should highlight here that we really take a multimodal perspective, covering also not only train, but also coach and aircraft. I should highlight one additional point here in the study is that the core of the analysis is focused on the case where vaccines were not widely available. However, this has been complemented by assessment of the potential influence of vaccines on risk for travelers. So that's the study question. Now, a bit of information about the scope of the study. And first of all, it should be highlighted that we focus on the travel itself, involving traveling seated passengers. So it means that in terms of calculating the risk, we have excluded the time to reach the transport means. Boarding, disembarking are excluded. And then also it should be highlighted that the model has been developed for long distance travel. Moreover, we consider that the primary personal risk considered is the risk of death from COVID, while the secondary risk is hospitalization, especially also considering long COVID. Both incremental fatality risk from COVID-19 infection and the overall fatality risk on board have to be estimated. So it means you need to start making assumptions in order to deliver the answers to the study questions that are highlighted earlier. We have also been looking at two travel options considered, one in which for collective modes of transport, one in which all seats are fully occupied, but no passenger standing in the aisle. That's the first case. And the other one is a 50% loading factor for train and coach, and a middle seat empty for air. Other modes considered are, already mentioned, air traveling, coach, and car in addition to train. And then just briefly, the underpinning modeling behind the estimation, the modeling of COVID risk for passengers. It is, of course, a very technical slide, but just highlighting what was the modeling behind this slide gives the details. And in short, when we talk about incremental risk for COVID passengers, the way that the model works is that we determine first what is the probability of a given passenger to be contagious, multiplied with the probability of a virus transmission from that passenger to a healthy one that is also on board the train, multiplied with the probability of death / hospitalization from disease. So that's the underpinning model. The study paper goes more in detail regarding how we have valued and estimated each of those probabilities in the case of rail, in the case of coach, and in the case of aviation. I will now take you through what I mentioned a bit earlier. You can see already on the slide the assumptions, and on the slide you can see some of the main assumptions made. I should highlight that what we're also talking about is, as assumption, is the number of actual cases of COVID compared to the confirmed positively tested cases, which is likely to be a high number. Okay, and I'll go, and other assumptions are listed in the study, like an uninfected passenger is directly threatened with COVID-19 by a contagious passenger sitting either in the same row as the passenger, the row ahead, or the row behind. We're also talking about, so this is more about distance between travelers for infection. Then there's an issue about the exposure time. And here we adopt the 15 minutes of co-travel time, whereas the proportion of passengers traveling unseated for this type of journey is considered nil. Okay, and we further assume that there's a rather limited risk of infection from contagious passengers not seated nearby. There are a few other assumptions listed in the study, but I will jump to the next slide so you can read for yourself the additional options that we have put in place for the modeling. And then we come to the issue I mentioned about the study findings. Traveling on board of shared means of, so I will go through the key findings of the study. First of all, traveling on board of shared means of transportation at times of COVID-19 infection prevalence among the general population implies a new specific mortality to passengers. This is a risk that is a fewfold higher than the basic safety risk, so linked to accident, and the overall fatality risk for passengers on board is then expressed as a proportion of the car fatality risk. However, so we know there's a new risk. However, our finding is that in all scenarios modeled for rail and at the current infection prevalence in the population, it remains somewhat lower compared to the overall travel risk for individual travelers, notably those traveling in a passenger car. This finding of rail compared to car applies both in the case of full occupancy for trains and also in the case where the occupancy rate is only 50%. And in that case, the overall fatality risk for rail travel is significantly lower compared to car travel. And then, of course, we can add the issue of vaccines coming into play. And there we have a result suggesting that the overall fatality risk in the case of vaccine distribution and efficacy, that the overall fatality risk would be some 10 times lower than the corresponding risk for car travel.